Look, I'm a sound designer. Or, I was a sound designer. And before you ask, no, I didn't work on movies or music, I worked on apps. You know, those tiny little sonic rewards that trick your brain into thinking you accomplished something. The satisfying swoosh when you delete an email, the little digital pop when you earn a badge, the gentle, encouraging chime that tells you, hey, good job, keep spending. That was my life for 7 straight years in downtown Seattle. A never-ending symphony of designed noise. I was creating the auditory wallpaper of the modern existence, and man, was it loud. But the worst part? It wasn't the external noise. It was the internal kind. It was the constant hum of 1,000 unfinished tasks, the phantom vibrations of my phone, the mental echo of every notification that had ever gone off within a 5-mile radius. My anxiety wasn't just mental, it was sonic. I used to stand in my apartment, surrounded by noise-canceling technology, and swear I could still hear the distant, high-pitched whine of the server farm across town. I burned out. Hard. I didn't want peace, I wanted annihilation. I wanted a place so quiet, so isolated, that the only sound left in the world was the sound of my own blood moving. And that's how I found the listing. It was buried deep in a niche job board, archivist/caretaker needed for private coastal library. Extreme isolation. No digital connectivity. Must be comfortable with long-term solitude. The pay was insane, and the requirements were minimal: catalog old books, keep the place clean, and keep the climate stable. It was perfect. The place was called the Tome of Tides. The drive there was biblical. It took me 3 hours past the point where the roads were paved, winding up the Oregon coast on a crumbling, one-lane service path. When I finally crested the ridge, I saw it. It wasn't a building, it was an outcrop. The library was a massive, dark, monolithic structure that seemed to have grown right out of the sheer basalt cliff face. It had no obvious windows facing the ocean, just thick, scarred stone. The roof was covered in a crust of salt and lichen. It looked less like a building and more like a tomb that had been left to the elements for 1,000 years. The caretaker I replaced, a pale man named Thomas who looked like he hadn't slept since the Clinton administration, met me at the door. He didn't smile, and his hands trembled the entire time he gave me the keys. No phones, no Wi-Fi, no signal at all, he rasped, his voice barely audible over the roaring wind. Just the library, and the ocean. Exactly what you wanted, right? Absolute silence, I confirmed, taking a deep, cold breath. He just shook his head, looking out at the endless gray sea. No, kid. Not silence. Never silence. Just, a different kind of sound. He left me with a small, sputtering diesel generator, a tank of propane, a two-way satellite radio that only connected to a single encrypted frequency, and a stack of weekly letters addressed to the caretaker. Then, Thomas got into his rusty pickup and drove away without a backward glance. He didn't even wait for me to close the door. That night, alone in the Tome of Tides, the only sound was the massive, percussive crack of the Pacific slamming against the cliff face, shaking the very foundation of the library. It was terrifying, oppressive, and absolutely everything I had ever wanted. My first 2 weeks were a strange kind of bliss. I lived on instant coffee and canned soup, spending my days simply organizing and cleaning. The interior of the library was labyrinthine. It was cold, stone, and smelled like dried salt and old paper. The main room was massive, 3 stories tall, lined floor to ceiling with tight, spiraling bookshelves. The books themselves were odd. They weren't fiction or history. They were ancient-looking, leather-bound, and filled with diagrams I couldn't understand, arcane mathematics, celestial charts, and what looked like medieval anatomical drawings, all centered around the human skull and throat. Every Sunday, a sealed, unmarked letter would arrive via a remote drone drop, always signed simply, the proprietor. These letters contained my instructions for the week. They were never about finances or cleaning protocols, they were always about sound and placement. That's when the rules started. They weren't logical, they were ritualistic. And man, were they specific. The first rule was about the tide. It was the least spooky, but the most pressing. Rule number 1, the midnight high tide protocol. When the great swell rolls in, approximately 3:03 a.m., the library is calibrated. You must ensure that no volume leaves its shelf. If a single book touches the stone floor during this time, the classification fails. We cannot afford failure. I thought this was just a weird insurance policy. The 3:03 a.m. tide was powerful. The entire building would groan and shudder. I had to do a full floor patrol before 3 a.m., just pushing the heavy, dusty books flush against the shelves. Then came the spine-chilling rule, the one that made me start looking over my shoulder. Rule number 2, the unclassified tomes. In the deepest recess of the third gallery, there are volumes lacking spine markings. These are the unclassified tomes. They must be shelved, pages facing the inner wall. You must never attempt to open them. You must never attempt to touch them. They are not waiting for you to read them, they are waiting for their turn. I found them exactly where the letter said they would be. About 100 massive, blank-spined books, crammed into the darkest corner of the highest gallery. They weren't dusty, they felt almost damp. They were bound in something that looked like dried, stretched human skin. I hated going near them, but I meticulously followed the rule, ensuring every one of their page edges faced the cold, stone wall. Why pages facing the wall? It felt like some sort of sensory deprivation chamber for books. But the final rule, the one about silence, was the one that made me question my sanity and realize I hadn't escaped the noise. I had just entered a very specific, much older kind of sound hell. Rule number 3, the core section voice protocol. In the core section, the central spiral, the atmosphere must remain pure. You are authorized to whisper necessary work instructions or count. You are strictly forbidden from emitting any sound charged with emotion, singing, crying, laughter, or the sound of profound fear. I thought, who sings or cries in a library? But that last part, profound fear, stuck with me. It was like they knew that was the most likely sound I would eventually make. My solitude quickly curdled into paranoia. During my 3 a.m. tide patrol, I started hearing things. Not the ocean. Something else. When the walls stopped shaking, and the air was dead silent for that 1 second before the next wave hit, I would hear a faint, scratching, whispering sound coming from the shelves. It sounded like someone trying to speak through a throat full of sand. I would rush back to my station, heart hammering, but never broke rule number 3. I never looked back. The proprietor's letters became increasingly focused on the quality of the sound atmosphere. They'd ask about wind direction, atmospheric pressure, and whether the ambient tonal clarity was high. It was all esoteric nonsense, but it terrified me because it confirmed that this entire place was a machine designed to harvest sound. My morbid curiosity finally won out over my survival instinct. I started to suspect the unclassified tomes weren't just blank. They were forbidden. And that meant they held the key. I waited for a calm night, a night when the diesel generator was running smooth and the tide was low. I climbed the central spiral ladder to the third gallery. My hands were sweating so badly I almost slipped on the rungs. I stood before the wall of blank spines, the air here feeling visibly heavier and colder than the rest of the library. They didn't feel like paper and ink, they felt like silent, waiting organs. I picked the smallest one, the one closest to the edge, and I broke rule number 2. I didn't just touch it, I pulled it from the shelf. The air immediately went flat. The sound of the generator, the distant ocean roar, it all seemed to recede, as if my ears were suddenly packed with cotton. I carried the book down to my desk, my heart pounding a rhythm that sounded deafening in the sudden quiet. When I opened it, the contents weren't text. They were horrifying. The pages were thin, translucent, and covered in what looked like faded blood, or maybe sepia ink. They weren't written records, they were meticulously hand-drawn diagrams. One page showed a cross-section of a human head, but instead of the brain, the skull was filled with complicated, spiraling lines. Next to it was a column of figures, not coordinates, but sound wave frequencies. At the bottom of the page, in tiny, elegant script, was a single label, the A7 cry. I flipped the page. This one had intricate drawings of the human larynx and pharynx, showing exactly which muscles contract during a scream. On the facing page was a complex, beautiful, and utterly chilling waveform pattern, like a musical score, but infinitely more complicated. Label at the bottom, frequency of utter abandonment, subject delta 4. That's when the terror truly hit me. This wasn't a library, it was an archive of pure human suffering. The proprietor wasn't collecting old books, they were collecting, classifying, and storing the most raw, potent sound that a human being could produce, the sound of profound, existential fear. And the unclassified tomes? They weren't blank. They were the ones still being written. They were waiting for new data. They were waiting for my sound. The quiet I had craved was a trap. This entire building was an enormous, sound-dampened recording studio, and I was the isolated subject, waiting for the perfect sonic trigger. I slammed the book shut, my breath ragged and short. I violated the atmosphere of the core section with a sound of panic, a sharp, gasping inhale, and instantly, the low, scratching, sandy whispering from the shelves intensified. It was all around me, thousands of tiny voices trying to push through the leather bindings, calling to the open book on my desk. The next week was hell. I couldn't sleep. Every night, the tide grew louder, the scratching grew more frantic, and I started seeing movement in the periphery of my headlamp beam, shadows that darted behind the book stacks. The final night came with a perfect, terrifying storm. It wasn't just rain and wind, it was a furious, violent, historical tempest that hit the coast like a cannonball. The roar of the waves was continuous, but somehow, underneath it, the silence within the library was even more pronounced. My 3 a.m. patrol felt like a death march. The entire building was shaking so violently that books were actually bouncing on the shelves. I was scrambling, pushing them back, feeling the stone floor shudder beneath my boots. Then, it happened. Right at 3:03 a.m., as the midnight high tide protocol began its calibration, a massive, lead-bound volume from the ancient history section was shaken loose. It tumbled, bouncing off a lower shelf, and hit the stone floor with a dull, sickening thud. The sound of the ocean stopped. The sound of the wind stopped. The sound of the generator stopped. There was only a total, absolute, ear-splitting vacuum of silence. I froze, covered in sweat, looking at the fallen book. I had failed rule number 1. The classification had failed. And that's when the library turned on me. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, it was a sound I heard with my soul. It was a sudden, massive, cacophonous rush of voices. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Every single scream, sob, wail, and shriek that had ever been archived in the Tome of Tides was instantaneously unleashed. It wasn't external. It was internal. It was like every microphone, every acoustic panel, and every single volume in the library was projecting sound directly into the center of my skull, bypassing my eardrums entirely. I'm falling. I can't stop falling. Where is the light? I can't see. I can't see. The water is too cold, the water is too cold. I didn't mean to hurt them. I didn't mean it. It was a psychic tidal wave of pure, unfiltered terror and regret. I fell to my knees, clawing at my head, trying to make it stop. I could feel the individual frequency patterns described in the unclassified tome burning into my memory. This was the frequency of utter abandonment, subject delta 4. This was the sound of true, final fear. I saw the unclassified tomes. They were no longer facing the wall. They were pulled halfway off the shelf, their bindings pulsing with a wet, sickly yellow light. They were hungry. They were ready to be written. And they were waiting for the sound of my profound fear. I knew what I had to do. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the screaming voices tearing through my mind. I ran to the generator room, grabbed the 5-gallon kerosene can I used for the emergency lamp, and raced back to the third gallery. With the screams of the dead echoing in my bones, I soaked the unclassified tomes, the entire corner of the library, in fuel. The proprietor wanted me to respect the books. Fine. I would give them a final classification. I pulled out the emergency flare, struck the match, and threw it. The sound of the kerosene-fueled inferno was the first real sound I had heard in weeks. It was loud, chaotic, and blessedly physical. The flames licked up the wall, consuming the human skin bindings and the terrifying diagrams. As the unclassified tomes burned, the psychic screaming stopped. It was instantly replaced by a sound even more disturbing, a low, guttural, heartbroken shriek that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the library itself, a sound of ancient, terrible loss. The proprietor was mourning their lost archive. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack, my keys, and the satellite radio. The fire was spreading, the stone was cracking, and the ocean was still trying to break down the walls. I ran out of the Tome of Tides and didn't stop until I collapsed on the ridge, watching the ancient, monolithic building dissolve into the storm and the sea. They found me 3 days later, wandering down a logging road, dehydrated and covered in soot. The local authorities dismissed the library's disappearance as a combination of extreme weather erosion and a forgotten structure finally succumbing to the sea. The proprietor? Never contacted. Never identified. I told them nothing about the screams, the diagrams, or the unclassified tomes. But I never got what I asked for. I never got the silence. I'm back in the city now. I'm safe. I have a tiny apartment and I only use an old flip phone. I tried to go back to sound design, but I can't. The world is still loud, man. You know, the sirens, the traffic, the constant digital chatter. But for me? It's all hollow. I hear the noises, but I don't feel them. When my neighbor laughs, it's just a series of compressed waveforms, lacking depth. When I hear a siren, it's just a pattern, devoid of urgency. It's like the whole world is operating on a lower sample rate, and all the richness, all the soul of the sound, has been stripped away. The ancient ritual of the Tome of Tides didn't just capture fear, it captured the essence of human emotion through sound. And when I destroyed that archive, I didn't save the world from noise, I saved it from one form of capture, but I ended up trapping myself in another. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet, I can still hear them. Not the screams, but the scratching. The faint, sandy whispers from the third gallery. They are in my walls now. They are in my headphone speakers. They are in the air. And they're waiting for me to make a sound of profound emotion again. Because they know the one sound I am now incapable of making, the sound of true, untainted joy. I was searching for silence to escape the noise. But trust me on this, be terrified of absolute silence. Because the moment you find it, you become the most valuable thing in the world to someone else. You become the perfect, uncorrupted recording medium. So go ahead. Enjoy the clamor. Enjoy the chaos. Enjoy the music and the laughter and the noise. Because the minute you wish it all away, you might just find that the silence is listening, and it's got a very specific, very old book, with a blank spine, waiting to record you. And remember the proprietor's final rule, they are not waiting for you to read them, they are waiting for their turn.